You know that feeling of walking into a completely normal place and, within seconds, something already feels slightly off, even though nothing obvious has happened yet? It's not really about the environment itself, but about what starts happening inside you. Like your mind immediately begins picking up on details that most people either don't notice or simply ignore. It can be something almost invisible, like a hesitation in someone's voice, a reaction that feels slightly out of sync, or a silence that seems heavier than the situation would normally justify. And while everything continues as if it's completely normal, you're already processing multiple layers at the same time, trying to make sense of things that no one else is even acknowledging. And that alone is enough to make you feel mentally tired before anything meaningful even begins. What makes this more confusing is that, from the outside, it often gets labeled as overthinking, as if you were adding complexity to something simple. But that explanation rarely feels accurate because it doesn't feel like you're creating anything. It feels like you're noticing what's already there. There's a very real difference between imagining patterns and recognizing them, and your mind has become highly efficient at recognizing them quickly, sometimes instantly. This kind of awareness usually develops for a reason, especially in environments where paying attention to subtle emotional cues made a difference, where understanding what wasn't being said helped you navigate situations more safely or more effectively. Over time, your brain adapts to that need and refines that ability, becoming more sensitive to inconsistencies, more alert to shifts in tone and behavior, and more inclined to scan for meaning beneath the surface. The part that no one really talks about is what happens after that ability becomes automatic, because it doesn't just stay in the situations where it was originally useful, it follows you everywhere. In conversations that are supposed to be simple, your mind is already a few steps ahead, mapping possible outcomes based on patterns it has seen before. You hear the beginning of a sentence, and something in you already predicts where it's going, not because you're trying to control the situation, but because your brain has learned to connect emotional sequences very quickly. That anticipation creates a subtle distance because instead of fully engaging with what is happening in the moment, part of you is already processing what is likely to happen next. This becomes even more noticeable in relationships, where you start to recognize repeated behaviors before they fully reveal themselves. You might notice small inconsistencies early on, things that don't quite align but are easy to overlook if you choose to, except you don't really have that option anymore. Once your mind sees the pattern, it holds on to it. And instead of reacting immediately, you often choose to stay quiet, not because you don't care, but because you already understand how these situations tend to unfold. You've seen similar dynamics before, and you know that pointing them out doesn't always lead to clarity. Sometimes it just creates tension or misunderstanding. So you keep it to yourself. And over time, that becomes a habit. That habit of internalizing what you notice starts to build something subtle but persistent inside you. It's not anger in a clear, explosive way, and it's not exactly frustration either, but it's a kind of quiet pressure that comes from repeatedly seeing things you don't express. It accumulates in small amounts through everyday interactions until it turns into a background feeling that's hard to define but impossible to ignore. You might find yourself feeling drained after being around people, even if nothing significant happened. And that's because your mind has been working continuously, processing layers that never get released. At some point, you also realize that this way of perceiving things changes how you connect with others. It's not that you lose interest in people, but connection starts to feel more complicated. When you're aware of multiple layers in a conversation, it becomes harder to stay in the simplicity of the moment. There's always something else being noticed, something else being interpreted, and that can create a sense of separation that isn't visible from the outside. You're present, you're listening, you're participating, but internally there's a part of you that remains slightly distant, observing instead of fully experiencing. This distance can become even more pronounced because it doesn't only apply to how you see others, but also to how you see yourself. The same awareness that allows you to notice subtle details in people also turns inward, leading to a constant process of self-observation. You replay conversations, analyze your reactions, think about what you could have said differently, and try to adjust your behavior based on those reflections. In some ways, this can make you more thoughtful and intentional, but it also makes it harder to relax because your mind rarely stops processing. Even in moments that are meant to feel light or spontaneous, there is still a layer of analysis happening in the background. Over time, this creates a feeling that is difficult to explain to others, because it's not just about being introverted or preferring solitude. It's about experiencing reality with an extra layer that doesn't turn off. Sometimes this makes you feel out of sync with people, as if you're engaging in the same interaction but interpreting it in a completely different way. Other times, it can create a subtle sense of being ahead, not in a superior way, but in the sense that you're seeing patterns before they fully unfold. But neither of those perspectives feels comfortable, because both of them create distance, and that distance can slowly turn into isolation if it's not understood. There is also a deeper layer to this that is often overlooked, which is the role this perception plays in giving you a sense of control. When you can anticipate outcomes, you feel more prepared. When you can read emotional shifts early, you feel less likely to be caught off guard. This means that your awareness is not just passive observation, it's also a form of protection. It helps you navigate situations with more caution, reducing the chances of being surprised or hurt in ways that might have affected you before. Without realizing it, your mind uses this constant scanning as a way to stay safe. But that safety comes with a cost that isn't always obvious at first. The more you rely on anticipation, the less you allow yourself to be present in the moment. The more you analyze, the harder it becomes to experience things without filtering them through interpretation. This creates a subtle tension between understanding and feeling, where clarity starts to replace spontaneity, and awareness begins to create distance instead of connection. You may find that even when you want to fully engage, something in you holds back, not out of fear in an obvious sense, but out of habit. At some point, it becomes important to recognize that this pattern is not something you need to eliminate, because it's part of how your mind has learned to function, but it is something you need to understand in a different way. The goal is not to stop noticing details or to force yourself to think less, because that would go against how your brain naturally operates. The real shift happens when you begin to separate perception from control, when you allow yourself to notice things without immediately trying to predict or manage what will happen next. This means learning to stay in the moment, even when your mind is offering you a preview of where things might go. It means allowing conversations to unfold without constantly comparing them to past patterns, and giving people space to show who they are beyond what you expect. It also means giving yourself permission to experience emotions without needing to analyze them in real time. Trusting that not everything needs to be understood immediately in order to be valid. When you start to approach it this way, the weight of noticing everything begins to change. It doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes less overwhelming because it's no longer tied to the need to control or predict every outcome. Instead, it becomes something you can carry with more awareness, without letting it create distance between you and your own experiences. You're not broken for perceiving things this way, and you're not exaggerating reality. Your mind developed a heightened sensitivity to patterns and emotional cues for a reason, and that ability has value. The part that was missing was never why you are like this, but how to live with it in a way that doesn't isolate you from others or from yourself. And when that understanding starts to settle in, even a little, something shifts internally. The same awareness that once felt like a burden begins to feel more manageable because you're no longer fighting it or being controlled by it. You start to see it for what it is, a tool that can either create distance or deepen your understanding, depending on how you relate to it. And maybe that's the point where things begin to feel different, not because you've changed who you are, but because you've changed how you experience what has always been there. You're not the only one who feels this way, even if it often seems like it. Most people just don't have the language to describe it, or they've never stopped long enough to recognize it in themselves. But now that you can see it more clearly, it becomes harder to believe that there was ever something wrong with you. There wasn't. You just never had this explained before. If this felt familiar in a way you couldn't quite explain before, then maybe this wasn't just another video you watched. Maybe it was something you recognized. And if a part of you stayed quiet while listening to this, like it was just observing everything and thinking, this is exactly it, then you already know this goes deeper than it seems. You don't have to figure everything out right now. Sometimes just recognizing the pattern is enough to start seeing things differently. And if you've been carrying this alone for a long time, without really having the words for it, there are more of these conversations here, waiting for you when you're ready to keep exploring. If this connected with you, you can stay close, subscribe, and come back to this space whenever you need to understand yourself a little more clearly. Because the more you start to see what's really happening inside you, the less it feels like something is wrong.